Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Bujno. Welcome to Ethics and Moral Problems here at Northampton. In this first lecture, we're going to look at why we even study philosophy, and we'll delve into a little bit of how it helps us develop meaning and a certain attitude that we bring to ourselves and to others, and how it is all formed by this idea and sense of discovery. More on that in a second. So we're going to ask the biggest questions here, and this is sort of like my pitch for the course, like why is philosophy worth pursuing? Because the reality is that over time, education has changed, at least our focus on what it's supposed to exactly do for us. We really think in a utilitarian fashion today that education is a means to getting a job. Now, there's something obviously true to that. Nobody goes and pursues these things without the expectation that they're somehow going to offer them opportunities in employment. So I hope you get this degree and also, get a future position somewhere. But if that's all it was, like if we were going to reduce this down to a vocational school, which, by the way, is not a bad thing. But the reality is that even people that are going through HVAC or nursing and such still need to have a liberal education because there's a lot of things that we encounter in life that simply aren't just part of the focus of our particular job. So let me say this. In ancient Greece, free persons were trained in philosophy, art, mathematics, the natural science, and such. Only slaves were trained to just do that one thing. The reality was they didn't need any skills or any understanding of anything beyond the task that was in front of them. So if we're going to talk in some way about what it means to be free, what freedom is, we're going to have to sort of like reimagine that word because it's typically heard by us in the modern world as an autonomy and the lack of restraint. So a person who is free is allowed to do certain things. But be very careful that that isn't just reduced down to liberty, because freedom is the ability to do that which we were designed to do. We'll get into that later. But think of it this way as an example. A person who is at the piano and has the highest level of freedom is able to play whatever score is placed in front of them, at least within reason. A toddler can just sit at the piano and pound out, just pound out the keys. That is an autonomy, but there's nothing free there. They seem to be held back by their lack of understanding on how to use this thing. So we're going to look at it that way. And also, it's very easy for us to think that our reasoning process is unique. In other words, it's an understanding of hubris, we could say, that people of any given time think that they're almost at the pinnacle of understanding things in the world, understandings of each other, human persons, sexuality, you can go on. And we look back at those that came before us as troglodytes that didn't have the understanding that we do, not realizing that the future is going to look back at us in the same way that we look back at people 150 years ago and how they don't grasp things in the same way that we do. So we have to be very careful here that what appears at first glance as unique thinking is really nothing more than the thinking of our age. In other words, we don't want to be part of the herd. And when we say that we would like to think for ourselves, remember that requires quite a bit. It requires understanding and knowledge, and the penetration of wisdom is what we're talking about in here. The idea of philosophy is the love of wisdom. It penetrates those highest things. So it's just something to keep in the back of our mind. Now, we're going to try to come with the biggest questions. If that sounds too abstract and not useful, know this. Probably the most sublime things in our life are those things that you cannot simply learn vocationally. Think of beauty, truth, and goodness. Why do we call things beautiful? Why do we call them good? And why do we call certain things true? How about the way that we act on these things? Justice, equality, liberty, love. I mean, these are the types of things that people have, quite frankly, been willing to both live and die for. Well, these ideas, we're going to call them ideas, in the realm of philosophy, and by the way, there's no amount of money that's going to offer you these understandings of these things. This is much higher, if you want to call it that, than simply having success in one's career. As good as that is, those are all good things. So, beauty, truth, and goodness, these things are known as the transcendentals. They're timeless. They're not bound by age, and they're universal. It doesn't matter where we live or when we live. They're not bound by culture or country, and they're shared by both gods and humans. They're also, whether or not you've ever thought about it, beauty, truth, and goodness is how we know things. See, we're attracted to things that are beautiful, like the thoughts and the actions and the people who have beautiful souls. And through encountering that, or them, we recognize the truth. And in that truth, then it leads to goodness. You know, we can even call that a happiness, as long as you understand it not simply as what makes you or I individually content, but something that fulfills us truly as human persons. So in philosophy, that's known as the epistemological ladder. And education used to be the way up that ladder. But we've made it utilitarian, so we've sort of have, especially when it comes to beauty, we'll get to that perhaps. If we leave it purely in the subjective, we don't have that bottom rung to get to either truth or goodness. So hopefully this will all make sense as we move on in the course and such. So anyway, one aspect that we can say we're going to study here, a method, and we could almost see this overlapping other disciplines such as economics, like what types of financial distributions are just, or even neuroscience. How does freedom relate to our understanding of neurobiology in the brain, and so on. The reality is that the distinction the philosophers ask is a different type of question. Originally there were only two disciplines in times gone by: theology and philosophy. Theology was relative to revealed truths, and philosophy was everything else. It was only really in the last, maybe half millennia or so, where philosophy has become a subject in itself. Anyway, in that philosophy is the application of rational thought to problems. You can imagine that there is much it's going to contribute to whatever other discipline that you are in at that time. Now, as far as subject matter, philosophy asks some very basic questions, and these basic questions sort of develop into subfields of philosophy themselves. So when we start asking, like, what exists, this is known as metaphysics. When the medical or technology field or whatever field you're in ask what is a person, and, that is within the competency of metaphysics, and we will get to that shortly. Another type of question is what or how do we know? And this is the field of epistemology. Now that may sound odd, but we claim to know things all the time. And philosophers want to know, but we also wanted to know how we know. And for instance, in science, something really isn't proven unless it's falsifiable. Now that's accepted as known because it cannot not to be known. That's epistemology. If that sounds confusing, for now, let's just leave it as is. The third type of question is what should we do? Now, this has to do with ethics and the focus of this course. Economics and medicine, they're all capable of discovering what we can do. That is with economics, how to increase production or profit, or in medicine, how to modify genetic traits, increase fertility. We can go on and on. But just because something can be done doesn't mean that it ought to be done. So once you get into the ought, that is the field of ethics, and also in terms of like genuine human happiness. If we're going to say that we want to do certain things for the public common good, we have to determine what is good for the person and what exactly is good. That's all within the field of ethics. I do want to say something just briefly here about what does it mean to say I. It may sound silly, and I want to just back up 1 second. Oftentimes the way that questions are phrased in philosophy, they sound odd to the average person because philosophy often investigates the most common and basic things that everybody else seems to take for granted. If you ever found certain musicians that can write, or poetry that seems to speak to you, so the lyrics of music or poems, and you're attracted to it because it seems like it's encapsulated your life. Well, how did that person know something about you? They didn't. They knew something about the human person and something universal about the human person. The same thing with comedy. We hear certain things and we laugh, and then once we hear it, it sounds obvious, but it's still funny because he pointed out something that seems absurd within our obvious world. So the neat thing about both artists and comedians, we can call comedians artists too, but regardless, is that they see the same world that everyone else does, but they notice something that is obvious. And they focus on it, and they bring attention to it, and then it's revealed to us. Philosophy has that ability. There's probably nothing more obvious than the fact that we are simply here. and that all the time you and I say I, or I say you. But the average person would not really be able to give an account of what this I means. Who is I? Why am I not you? As odd as that sounds, you're standing over here, I'm standing over here, I know that I'm not you. But what exactly constitutes this thing that we call ourselves? We're going to talk about that a little bit, all right? The third thing I just simply want to briefly address is philosophy is a subject matter that deals with this aspect of activity, right? An attitude of critical and systematic thoughtfulness, we could say. This includes very crucial concerns for human happiness, responsibility. In other words, do we have free will? Now, that seems to be one of those questions that most people don't really question. But from a purely atheistic point of view, if you are a materialist, it almost is essential that you become a determinist, which means that you do not have free will. You can choose which flavor of ice cream you want, but most things are governed by laws that we simply do not understand. By laws, I mean physical laws, biological laws that we've only started to begin to scratch the surface of. So we're going to have to understand, how does this aspect of free will relate to our own happiness and responsibility? Because if I can't choose something, how really can I be responsible for it? So it's also going to ask things like, and investigate, like, what is the goal for life? Am I my brother or my sister's keeper? Some questions like that. Those can be dealt with in theology too, but nothing here in philosophy is dogmatic. But nonetheless, both theology and philosophy often investigate some of these, we can call them higher truths, if we leave it at that. Now, just to wrap this up a little bit, you have to start asking yourself, what are the most important things in life? The reality is that there are some things in life that we pursue because they make us happy, and some things we do not pursue because it does not make us happy. But that word happy itself is rather vague. You can be happy depending on what food you like, or if you're able to stay home on a rainy day and watch a movie. But that's more of contentment, and it's not a bad thing, but it's not something that makes us genuinely happy. If we can look at the end of our lives and almost like in a retrospective, type, how do you want to say, example of trying to find out what's important. We vision ourselves at the end of our life, looking back and saying, like, what were the things that I'm proud of? Well, we work backwards. We want to do those things now, because we know that certain things that we pursue are not going to be those things on our deathbed that we wish we would have done more of. Nobody wishes that they worked more. We usually want to have spent more time with friendship and more time with family, and more time just, enjoying nature, perhaps just sitting outside and enjoying a beautiful rain, a sunset, you name it. So we're going to try to figure out what is these things that make us happy. Now, in the course of the world and world history, the things that we are going to ultimately pursue, I would say, are those things that are worth living for. And if you really want to know what are those things that are worth living for, then ask it in terms of the question, what is worth dying for? We would say that we would die for our parents, our children, our siblings and such, but the reality is people have died for truth and will continue to die for truth. Martin Luther King Jr. Could have lived a long, content life if he simply didn't pursue something that he felt passionate about. We do not wish the fact that he had been murdered, but the reality is that he put himself in harm's way to pursuing a particular truth. And he was glad of it, I'm sure, not obviously the end, but that he was pursuing it and he understood the risk. But we all do this, not to that extent. But it would be easy for us just to skate through life without really investigating anything deeply. Once we know that there are things worth dying for, then we could start to ask ourselves, well, then those things probably are worth living for. And it's going to be in those particular things where we find meaning. So that's how we're going to work backwards, and that's what this applies. So if this doesn't seem practical, then you almost have to ask yourself, is life worth living, and is there any meaning to life, and do I wish to be happy? Those particular things cannot be ferreted out in a vocational course, as important as those courses are. All right. So we're going to focus on a few things. We're going to connect meaning to happiness, and we're going to investigate how this is, let's say, connected directly to our understanding of the human person. One last thing. I should say this, and that then would be genuine freedom. None of this investigation, going from meaning to happiness to the human person as a free individual, we call that free agency. None of this is done without pain, right? Usually we need to be drug in to this because it's easy for us to eat if we're walking through the kitchen and we see a pile of cookies on the counter and we know supper's coming up, we know that it's just easier that I have a hunger pain now. I will just simply satisfy it, at least momentarily, by having the cookie. But the reality is that obviously will not be entirely good for us as a nutrient, nor will it satisfy our genuine hunger. So we have to, in the same way here, sort of be drugged out of the cave, from foolishness to wisdom, from ignorance to knowledge. So when you look at the animated video of Plato's allegory of the cave, pay close attention to how that man is brought out of the cave. They drag him out. His whole life, the only knowledge he had, and I won't explain the allegory here, but the only knowledge he had were the shadows on the cave wall. All those reflections that passed over the elevated walkway behind him and the fire, from the source of light. But once outside, he couldn't believe how things really were. Just like some discoveries that we make, and you've probably already made in your life, and you might make in this course, they become very difficult to explain, but we can't go back. So if you've ever had an experience that you can't unknow, that's a eureka experience. That's a sense of learning. That's something that cannot be unlearned. So, just like us, once the cave dweller knew the truth more fully, he wanted to go and share his newfound wisdom with his companions back in the cave. Not unlike if we have a really good meal somewhere, don't we go and tell people? If we have a really good experience somewhere, we tell people. Or if we see a really good movie or hear a good song, we tell people. But this is that times 100. He's learned some basic truths to reality, and he wants to share those. But they're not enlightened. They're still in the cave. For him, or for them, he was nothing more than another shadow. In fact, they'd rather kill him than be made free with knowledge. Some people would really not want to know the truth because it's more comfortable to live in the ignorance that they have. The reality is that if you've ever had a situation where you've tried to share a growth moment with somebody else and they dismissed it or thought it silly, it's because they did not share your experience, nor do they have that level of wisdom in that particular way. So none of this makes us better than anybody else, but it does make us wiser. So as we move through this course, and we begin to study and discuss these questions, think of how this sense of discovery relates, to the material that we're looking at. Having been enlightened on something, it doesn't make you or I better or more intelligent than anybody else. It just means that we discovered some good. And through beauty and truth, that discovery can't always be communicated to others directly. Sometimes one must experience it for themselves. And it doesn't always fall at some rational progression, like finding the answer for a math problems does. It's not a systematic thing you could work through. It requires something a little deeper. So it's this eureka movement. You're going to be asked to write an essay about a eureka moment in your life. Let me give you one, and I'll end on this. When I was a senior in high school, I remember my English literature teacher, Mr. Harwood Rhodes, as we walked into the classroom, he put these cryptograms up on the board. So they're jumbled letters that would, if you deciphered them, it would give you the phrase. Maybe something like, not unlike some game shows that are on TV. Okay, so for one, why are we doing this in English lit course? But two, I guess this is better than studying because this isn't going to be homework. So what happened was he'd put these things on the board, and the whole class individually, students would try to guess what it is. And sometimes the idea worked, well, that letter means this, and this letter means that, and others would correct that person. And eventually we'd get enough letters. So if you can imagine when there's enough up there that you start to see the whole picture, then you could solve it by saying this is what the phrase actually means. And we did this day after day for at least a week or so. And then one day he puts up an English sonnet, a Shakespearean sonnet. And he said, what do you think it means? And the same thing happened. Some students said this, somebody else might say, well, it has a tombstone in it, so somebody's dead. And somebody else says, well, but tombstones mean death, or at least, they um, they signify that somebody has died. But what else did they mean? Well, they could, in a sense, stand as a tribute to the person, a recognition that they lived. So anyway, my point is that we struggled through this. And eventually we got an understanding of this that seemed to work. And it was a consensus thing. We all kind of agreed, correcting each other. And then it was at that, exercise that we realized what he was doing. He was using an experience of discovery, starting out with these cryptograms. In other words, he thought there's no way I can teach these young people how to discover something until I just am explaining to them the process of discovery. So that's that's a eureka moment for me. I have plenty, but it's something that I continue to do in every single one of my classes. So in the back of our heads, let's know that philosophy is worth pursuing, and if we only try to reduce those things worth pursuing down to the practical, we're not going to be free people. We will become part of the herd. Philosophy is going to ask the biggest questions, right? So we're going to look at how we apply, certain things to rational thought. We are going to look at metaphysics, epistemology, even though we focus on ethics. We're going to spend some time trying to understand who is this I. And we're also going to understand how one thinks, because if you don't think about thinking, then how do you come up with a particular judgment, which is what we have to do. And in the end, I hope this adds something to our lives in the sense of the way that we pursue meaning. So thank you for listening.